Hello YouTube, Chrisiosity here. So I'm going to start out with some housekeeping and then I am going to move on to the main part of the video. So just bear with me for a couple minutes or skip ahead a couple minutes. So first I'm going to talk about the Rocky video, which many of you know I tried to put up and it got taken down and I appealed it and I did not win the appeal. So I am going to have to figure out a different way around. And you know what? It's a learning experience. As most of you know, I'm not really a movie critic. Live and learn, right? I have a couple of bits of news about MythCon. First is that on the panel that I was scheduled to be speaking on, which I will still be speaking on, this was a panel about intersectionality, and two of the people that were scheduled to speak against me, who were Peter Boghossian and James Lindsay, just dropped out. I don't know why. They'd been on the roster for months before I came on, and they just decided that they didn't want to be on it anymore, I guess. I don't know. So they dropped out, and Roaming Millennial, who I'm not really all that familiar with yet, but I've been starting to get familiar with her, she's coming on instead. So anyway, unfortunately, that makes a lot of the time I spent researching their arguments kind of moot, but what are you going to do, right? However, I feel that it is appropriate that I declare victory by default, and that's what I'm going to do. So I've prepared a celebration speech in honor of my own winning. Dear Peter and James, ha 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 ha, I win, you lose, because you are big old chickens. I do think that your decision to run away with your tail between your legs was wise, as I did plan to visit upon you intellectual punishment that I fear you would not have been able to withstand in a public forum. It would have caused you shame, humiliation, and disgrace, so I can respect the self-preservation that led you to folding like cheap shirts. In summation, I would only like to say, Neener, Neener, Neener. Thank you. Okay, obviously that was tongue-in-cheek. But hey, felt good anyway, and I do declare victory in default. So there you go. The second thing is, I don't know if anybody that's in my audience is going to be in the Milwaukee area. Oh God, is it next? Yeah, it's like next week. Perhaps the 21st, which is Friday. But if there's anybody that's going to be in that area and would like to say hello, put something in the comment section and maybe I'll hitch up. For most of the panel, there's going to be a VIP dinner, but it was not one that I felt comfortable going to. I can't really say much about it due to their security issues, so I'm not gonna, so I'm gonna be around. Let me know. Now, let's get on to the actual point of this video, which is to talk about free speech and platforming. And this is going to be a ramble. You see, I'm really concerned about the conflation of this whole platforming debate with the free speech debate. And I kind of feel like I need to break down why I'm concerned. So if you'll bear with me, let's start from the beginning. People generally know free speech, the right to self-expression, what that kind of means. Let me ask this question. Who gets free speech? Everybody, right? Every single person. You're born, and technically speaking, you don't have the ability to speak, but were you to have the ability, you have already been granted freedom of speech. And that's going to be with you until you die, in terms of the principle, in terms of the right. Nobody gets more or less of it than anybody else. No one person's free speech is more important than any other person's free speech. Okay, are we all together on this so far? I'm aware that there are certain situations, like people going to prison, they don't entirely lose their right, but it does become somewhat conscripted. But this comes along with it a lot of due process, and it's not an absolute thing. You still get your capacity for freedom of speech. You still have the right, the legal right, the human right, the inborn right. Now, contrast that with platforms. Platforms go to very few people. Platforms don't go to everybody. They are not equally distributed. Depending on the platform, they can be very difficult to get, though it certainly will always help if you have money, access, wealth, power, privilege. All of these things make a big difference to what kind of platform you have access to how big your net can be. So when people say you're not entitled to a platform, it means something more. There are lots of people who will never get platforms. The number of people who will never have a book published by a major publisher, who will never have their own TV show put on a major network or a minor network or any network, who will not be given a shot at Carnegie Hall, who will not get a job as the editor of a newspaper, who will not, etc., 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 etc. You get the point. These are aspects of wealth, power, privilege, and also might be merit as well, depending on what you mean by that. A person may earn their way. But again, this is an important thing. You don't earn your right to freedom of speech, and you don't lose it either based on your merit or lack of merit. These are two different concepts, and it's very, very, very important not to confuse them. Otherwise, you end up in a situation where you're taking away a person's actual freedoms because you've confused it with an entitlement. Freedoms and privileges should never be confused like this. Now, I'm going to show a brief video here. It's like from 2014, and just a short part of it, but it's kind of to talk about what I mean.
Hey, good. Do I get a discount here because of my white privilege? I don't? Okay, so I've been hearing I have like white privilege, and people have been saying that to me, but I'm not sure if it gets me a discount anywhere. I'm here in downtown DC, and I'm going to try to get an African-American perspective on white privilege. Have you heard the term white privilege?
Yes.
Have you heard the term white privilege?
Yes, I have.
You heard the term white privilege?
You mean like that article that was on the internet a few weeks ago?
Yeah, did you hear about that?
Yeah.
A lot of people are throwing this term out right now. It's white privilege, and I think what it means is the white people are treated in a different way in society, and they have certain advantages that people of color don't have. I mean, do you think that's true?
All right, so I put that in because it was funny, first off, but also to kind of point out this guy's just utter obliviousness. I don't know if anybody here has ever been to Washington, D.C., sort of walked around some of its areas. Large portions of it aren't exactly lifestyles of the rich and famous. It's kind of can be rough in places. And there are a lot of people there who don't have a lot of money. There are a lot of people there that work hard, and still, you know, it's not an easy place to make a living. It's not an easy place to become successful, which is fine. People still love it. But if you are a white guy and you're walking around with a microphone that costs who knows how much money, and other equipment that we don't even see, camera man that we don't even get to look at. What is his camera like? How much did that cost? You know, we're starting to talk about thousands of dollars of production costs of whatever this, I'm not really familiar with that station that he's affiliated with. Not a big watcher of that. If you could sit there with hundreds or thousands of dollars of equipment and production and a corporation of some sort behind you and walk into a depressed area in Washington, D.C. and ask Black people where your privilege is when you're kind of holding it. You've got it in your hand. Is somebody going to go and ask some random person that they meet in an urban area, some random Black person, and say, here, why don't I give you this camera and this microphone? Oh, I know. We'll go to an upscale white neighborhood and you can ask them about their privilege and be annoying. Like, that isn't really going to happen so much. So I think my point is becoming more and more clear. Do not conflate wealth, power, privilege, and property with the right to freedom of speech. Those are two different things. Take a person like Christina Hoff Sommers. This is a person who gets a lot of money from very rich people. The Koch brothers are paying for her vacations and her nice cars and for her trips around. The Koch brothers and people like that, I should say. She makes good money and she earns her money. Whether or not she believes the things she says or not are just not important to me. I don't care. I know that she provides value and that's why she gets paid. And she gets her books published. And she gets to go all around the country and talk to students and young people and old people and anybody she wants to. And that's fine. But when she steps onto a stage and a person from a marginalized group comes on and starts shouting, let's say, well, you know what? Christina Hoff Sommers doesn't have any freedom beyond that person in the other part of the room. Right? Her position behind the podium doesn't give her extra free speech points. There is an argument for pragmatism of saying that it would be so chaotic if we didn't have these social norms and practices that said, you know, we come for a speaker and we should hear the speaker that we come for and the speaker that we want. That is not either an embrace or a violation of freedom of speech. That is about practicality. I would argue that's about property. And I think that the reason that you're seeing this, I was thinking the other day about the free speech controversies that happened when I was younger, because I was wondering, why is the left not as forward on this? People talk about that. So I was thinking about that, and it's just, the simple fact of it is, the free speech concerns that get brought up are just not as valid. You know, in my day, like, we'd get upset if Congress was holding hearings about music, and that led to people putting those stickers, adult stickers, those labels that you see that tell you M or Y. So that was a big thing. But it was a big thing because it was Congress doing it. It was a big thing because it was legal. It was a big issue when NWA was arrested in Detroit for singing Fuck the Police. Again, because it's a government thing. Similarly, the things that I've been talking about on free speech on this channel, I've talked about suppression of prisoners. Specifically, I was talking about prisoners in Florida, but there are strikes going on all over prisons in our country, and there have been suppressions of people being put into solitary confinement, people being punished or treated harshly by guards, or people not being able to communicate from the inside to the outside and tell people even what's going on based on this desire to suppress their unionizing and striking for better conditions, which is their human rights to do, nonviolently, peacefully, to protest, to speak out against their conditions, to deal with that. I've talked about Doreen Tatour, who got a 5-month prison sentence in Israel as a Palestinian poet for her poetry. I've talked about those sorts of things on this channel. I've talked about Indigenous people having their rights suppressed as they protest with other water protectors against oil companies crossing rivers and that sort of thing. And those oil companies come with the army or the National Guard. So those are the things that I'm concerned about, the things where there's a government interaction. Again, if you go back to the Christina Hoff Sommers versus some young, poor, working class, marginalized person, and here's what I think is going on. Here's why we changed. It's neoliberalism. It's this idea that the way to fix freedom has to do with free markets and laissez-faire, and there's a lot of overflow between neoliberalism and libertarianism. They're not exactly the same thing, but they're, let's say, close philosophical cousins, right? And there's this concept that you will hear people say sometimes. You may have heard it, you may not. And that's the idea that we have these rights that we have, these basic inborn human rights, because we own ourselves. And that our basic rights are in fact a property right. That is really icky. It's just gross for a lot of reasons. It's very problematic. One of the reasons that it's problematic is because if our human rights are just another kind of property right, well, it stands to reason that the more property one has, the more rights one has. It's just a growth of your rights to grow in your property. Rights are property, so the more property you have, the more rights you must have. That's not a good implication. That's a bad implication. We should not have that implication. There's also a question there of, does this imply it's possible not to own yourself? That therefore someone else could own you? What would that mean? Why would this be a property right? Or if somebody's rights were curtailed, say, if they were put in prison, does that mean they are now property of the United States because we took some of their rights away? Are they partly our property now? So those are some very, very dark questions that come up with this. And that's just a couple of the problems with this whole way of conceiving of rights that I want people to have their antenna up for so that they can argue against it if they see it and say, no, we don't want this as a property right. This is not to say that I don't have autonomy over my own body or the rights to self-direction, but it's to say it's not because somebody handed me the title for my body when I was born. It's not because of ownership. It's because of this is an inherent status that human beings are granted in our society. That's the way we want it to be. That's what we have decided works best. One of our problems, and I do understand this, is that when people first started to talk about things like your natural freedoms, your inborn inherent freedoms, they appealed to God. You know, these are your God-given rights. These were endowed by your creator. And now that doesn't work anymore. But even though we don't necessarily seek out our creator for our rights, which certainly had its own problems as well, that never meant we wanted to give up our rights. Now, I've talked about humanism. I've talked about the veil of ignorance. I've talked about social justice before. I'm not going to go too deeply in those things now. I can make a follow-up video at some point to talk about them again if people want to hear that. But I think the bottom line is that for people who are interested in progressivism, the idea is we have these rights because that is what is just and equitable, and that is the kind of society that we want, one which is just and equitable and fair for people. We want to have these inborn rights, these rights that are equally distributed among everyone democratically, because we believe that to be the best way to put a society together that has the best outcomes. Because let's face it, everybody wants rights. Like 98% of people like rights and freedoms. You know? Sometimes they don't want them for everybody, but they generally always want them for themselves. And that's something that we should value. And yes, there is a part of that is choice, and people don't feel comfortable with choice. But, you know, it doesn't really work to just pass that off as a property right either, because then where do property rights come from? I don't know. What I do know is that we on the left have to start differentiating these things. It makes it very complicated sometimes because we're not capitalists. I'm not a capitalist anyway. Some people might be. And so I don't really like it that, say, Twitter or Facebook are privately owned companies that can do whatever they want. I would rather there be a public good version of Twitter, a public goods version of Facebook that people could have available to them, as opposed to having to deal with private entities. But that's what we have to work with, and so we must work within that. So I think we need to get much sharper in our focus and in our rhetoric where people are concerned about Twitter or Facebook or YouTube violations. We should bring up, what if we had a public YouTube, a public Twitter? The way that some TV stations have been publicly available or nationalized or something along those lines. I think that's the argument we could make that might be a winner to people concerned about the encroachment on their freedoms by major corporations, which is an understandable concern. when people bring up some of the protesters. Again, I think we have to be clear that we're not necessarily talking about a freedom of speech issue. And that's not a game we're going to play because it doesn't make any sense to play it. It doesn't make any more sense for someone to say that because a speech was denied at a university, somebody didn't get a chance to speak at a university, their free speech was harmed. That makes no more sense than to say, Penguin did not publish my book, therefore they have hurt my free speech. Sargon of Akkad needs to put me on his channel and feature me every single day. I'll upload to his channel every day, otherwise he's hurting my freedom of speech. This is unworkable as a concept and doesn't make any sense, and it's absurd. So we have to be very, 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 very specific and clear about that. And we need to just make that argument. It can be hard, but we have to do some pushing back here and putting things in more manageable positions. At the same time, we should discuss more often the real and genuine free speech concerns that we have. Government shutting down, scientists talking about global warming, people wanting to put laws in place where you can run protesters over if they're in the street. That's fucking ridiculous. And many leftists have talked about that. Anyway, I hope I've made my position on this understandable and clear and not been too repetitive. I wanted to make sure that people understood what I was getting at. I would like to thank all of my patrons: A Wingless Monkey, Andre Rodriguez, Armand, Brad Savvy, Bruce Bartup, Charlie Malone, Kabiza, Corey Johnston, Daniel Jones, Foston, Jesse Wynn, Joe Taylor, Joanna Carvalho, Jordy, Kevin Thurber, Christina L. Mogul, Marty Abernathy, Meridian, Mike Yoakum, Nick Hayden, Nikki Paprika, Russell, Sanji Nativis, Serena Gallagher, Some Random Geek, and Zara. Thank you guys so much. I really appreciate this. And to any other wonderful people out there who would like to also be on this list of beautiful, good-looking, intelligent people, I will include my Patreon link. And in any case, all the usual things that people ask for. Let's see, likes, comments, ringing the bell notification thingy. Those are all really good things too, because they help grow the channel and help just bring this out to more people. So that's awesome. And I appreciate everything and everyone. And thank you very much for listening. Love you all. See you after MythCon. I probably won't be able to get out another video until I get back because I'll be working on that. And yeah, bye.